So hello, I'm James Ford, and I am one of the community of the Empty Moon Zen Sangha. Today, a few words. There's a tradition. It tells us one of Jesus's apostles, Thomas, who we know as the Doubter, carried the message of Jesus all the way to India. There he found responsive hearts on the Malabar coast, and a small community began to flourish. Another tradition says that a few centuries later, the king of the area, Abner, was told by astrologers that his newborn son, Josaphat, would one day set aside kingship and become an exemplar of the Christian way. The king decided this would be a terrible thing. So he launched a persecution of the church, hoping that there would be nothing for his son to convert to. In the meantime, the king had his young son kept isolated in a pleasure palace where the boy would never hear the good news. One day, the now young man secretly left the palace to see the wider world. Almost immediately, he met the Christian hermit Barlaam. Barlaam told him of the way of unfolding love, and the message touched Josaphat's heart. He returned and told his father, who saw it was over, made his peace with it, and stopped the persecutions. He then shared his throne with Josaphat. Eventually, King Abner found the way touch him as well. He then abdicated his share of the throne to become a Christian hermit. Josaphat continued to rule for a time, but eventually he too abandoned rulership as the astrologers had foretold, and sought out his old teacher Barlaam. They lived in holy companionship for the rest of their lives. During those years, people came from all over the world to hear his guidance into the intimate. After Barlaam and Josaphat's deaths, people continued, right to this day, to make pilgrimages to their graves as healing shrines. This story was enshrined in the Roman martyrology, and the 27th of November in the West and the 26th of August in the East were set aside as feasts in honor of the saints Barlaam and Josaphat. Their celebration was woven into the great cycles of worship in the Christian churches. However, in the 19th century, scholars, especially those pesky Germans, began investigating many of the accumulated traditions of the church. And they found the true source of this story. As it turns out, the name Josaphat derived ultimately from the Sanskrit and means bodhisattva, enlightenment being. The scholarly community followed the sources through some interesting turns until confirming the story was really that of the Buddha. By the early 20th century, the mainstream liturgical churches had all quietly dropped the Christian celebration of the life of the Buddha from their calendars. The 27th of November, tomorrow. Noticing this opened a floodgate of thoughts and feelings for me about, a lot of things. But especially what might happen when we open our hearts to the liminal spaces. Those spots where things meet and overlap, where contradictions congregate, where, our hearts might open. Me, the rootedness of my spirituality is Zen Buddhism. It is a deep root. But as Johanna Macy, one of my teachers, described it, my natal tradition is Christianity. So I'm particularly interested in those places where Buddhism and Christianity meet. And today, I would like to share a little about those meetings. How especially stories like Barlaam and Josaphat, and to touch one or two others where this has happened as well. And then reflect briefly on what doors I find opening for me. And who knows, maybe for you as well. You've probably heard how Jesus traveled to India or perhaps Tibet. The idea has quite a sustained following, especially in India. The primary source for this, Nicholas Notovich's Life of Saint Isa, Best of the Sons of Men, has in fact never gone out of print since its first publication in 1894. I love the idea, and I wish it was true. Sadly, Notovich's book has been exposed as a fraud numerous times. Not that that unpleasantness has caused any decline in its popularity. But that isn't to say there hasn't been a bucketful of contact over the centuries. The Silk Road pretty much guaranteed that. But to the direct point of Jesus and Buddhism, there is absolutely no need for Jesus to have a Buddhist or any other non-Jewish influence. Everything we have of his teachings, in the earliest strata documents anyway, either reflect the normative Judaism of his time or are a wonderful extrapolation from those teachings and currents of that moment in time and space. To assert otherwise is to put oneself in the category of the people who figure the ancient Egyptians couldn't have built the pyramids. So, well, flying saucers. However, then there's what happened after Jesus' death. Several substantial scholars note possible connections between Buddhism and forming Christianity. Elaine Pagels, for instance, in her deep examination of the Gospel of Thomas, non-canonical, but of considerable antiquity with roughly the same dating as the Gospel of St. John, writes how, quote, some of it looks like Buddhism and may have in fact been influenced by a well-established Buddhist tradition at the time these texts were first written. May have, however, is an important phrase not to be glossed over. Many scholars see influences on Christianity through Gnosticism, which clearly has identifiable Buddhist connections. There are nonetheless some obvious stumbling blocks to anyone, say, like me, who would love to see a Buddhist-Christian synthesis from the beginning. But there is a gigantic problem in that. The core elements of traditional Christian monotheism and the core Buddhist observation that attempting to establish anything not subject to change is at the heart of human suffering becomes a circle very hard to square. These are wildly different traditions. Still, there was a substantial Buddhist presence in the eastern reaches of Alexander's empire. The Gandharan Buddhist community in present-day Pakistan and Afghanistan definitely sent missions westward. And pretty much as soon as we start getting a Christian literature, Buddhism is noted. Clement of Alexandria, who died in 215, alludes to Buddhism in his writings, and by the early 3rd and 4th centuries there are numerous, if garbled, references to Buddhism from Hippolytus, Epiphanius, Cyril of Jerusalem, and even the great Saint Jerome. But here's my favorite thing in the Buddhist-Christian saga. Since the 17th century, scholars east and west had been aware of a long-lost Christian mission in China. At that time, the early 17th century, Chinese scholars found a stela, big monument, erected in the 8th century. The text on it, written in Chinese and Syriac, recounts the early 7th century mission of Bishop Alapin and the establishment of the Luminous religion as a Chinese branch of the Church of the East, sometimes called the Nestorian Church. Incidentally, it is in all likelihood a mission from the Malabar coast and the real Thomas Church where the mythical Josaphat lived. The religion flourished for about 200 years before being swept away during a persecution of Buddhism. For the next 100 years, it was after the stela was found. It was fascinating. It was fascinating, but everything known was limited to what was on that monument. However, when the Dunhuang Library was uncovered in 1900, an East Asian version of the Dead Sea Scroll find, among the 50,000 documents uncovered were a trove of luminous religion texts. What's particularly interesting in reading them is how the luminous religion doesn't quite line up with Nestorian or even mainstream Christian orthodoxy in some very interesting ways. The Trinity, for instance, is mentioned, as is the Incarnation, but there's no reference to a crucifixion or a resurrection. In addition, the luminous religion has clearly synthesized Christianity with both Buddhism and, most of all, with Taoism. The only substantive question is, how much syncretism? The texts use lots of Taoist and Buddhist terminology. What we don't know is how much those terms were bent to Christian usage and how much they were simply adopted with something like their original meaning. Honest scholarship is divided on the subject. We can be sure something rich and compelling birthed in that strange and dangerous moment. I love Taoist and Buddhist ways of reading those texts and dream of that church and what could have been. So here we are today, another strange and dangerous moment. Terms like interfaith dialogue, cultural appropriation, and syncretism are used to describe a lot of what is going on. For me, they point to a range of things from how people thoughtlessly take someone's sacred symbols as decorations, to how our deepest quest for meaning and purpose, our individual quests, and our mutating cultures, of which religion are always an aspect, are fragmenting and reforming. It's critical we bring our hearts and minds to these matters, to look hard at what is and what might be. And here's one way to look at the matter with a wise heart. As a Zen person, I'm fascinated by the number of Jewish and Christian Zen masters. These are people who feel strongly they've not left their natal traditions but are embracing Zen's practice, and most importantly, its core teachings. I'm not talking spiritual tourists. Some of these are our most important Zen teachers in the West. People watching this meeting of Buddhism and Christianity are increasingly speaking of non-dual Christianity. It's an emerging theological perspective. It takes a stance that arose in the Indian subcontinent and applies it to the Christian tradition. I won't try to unpack non-duality in any substantive way, and actually a precise definition is going to be elusive, and different religions approach it, well, differently. But in essence, non-dual suggests an intimate relationship between the multiplicity of things, finding some kind of binding unity among these many things. Some see the many a dream of the one. Others that the one is a substratum to all phenomena. In Zen Buddhism, given our particular wrinkle on non-duality, we say not one, not two, or as a kind of shorthand, simply not two. This not to points to the salvific vision of our enlightenment. It is where we open our hearts and minds and discover the world is more intimate than words can say. There's another shorthand in Zen, by the by, intimate. As it turns out, pretty much all religions have some kind of analog to this perspective of a binding unity somewhere in their traditions. Usually it's found in the mystical aspect of that tradition. In Christianity, we see all sorts of places for this, starting with aspects of the Gospel of John. Remember those possible Buddhist connections. That's where we find the line, I am the vine and you are the branches. Building upon the mystical tradition of Christianity, particularly is found in the continuing thread from Pseudo-Dionysius to the author of the Cloud of Unknowing, to John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila, to Meister Eckhart, to a host of modern writers who probably can be gathered together under the general rubric non-dual. And that, as they say, only begins a list. So, what to do with this? I've actually written and discarded two different conclusions from this spot. There are so many ways to go from here. Of course, all the religions have a lot that's incompatible. A lot. First, how those basic truth claims among the religions are wildly different. traditional Christianity's peculiar version of monotheism, Buddhism's claim of a wild and fruitful insubstantiality. That's on the ground. Next, a great deal of what religion about is cultural cohesion. At its ugliest, it is crowd control, defining who is in and who is out. This stuff about our intimate connections we find in mystical religion is anathema to that cultural cohesion aspect of religion, and we see some pretty ugly pushback. In some parts of the world, to speak of the oneness of us all can get you killed. Religion is an expression of culture, and we are, as I noted earlier, in a wild and dangerous time. Cultures are unraveling, and maybe something new is emerging, a world perspective. But that universalist perspective, another word used by some non-dualists, I believe is always going to have a local expression. Near as I can tell, the universal is always only known in some particular. At its best, in my view, when we see the syncretistic expressions of spirituality, like in these wonderful meetings of Buddhism and Christianity, at least some of these meetings, I believe we're seeing the rise of a new cultural expression. What that is emerging. What that is emerging is not yet clear. But something is happening. Did I mention dangerous? Did I note people are pushing back? Did I say in some places this sort of thing can get you killed? So, and to end this, a shift to the confessional, my place in this mess. I'm not sure now, perhaps 20 years ago, certainly close to it, I found myself sitting in the sanctuary of the First Unitarian Society in Newton, a suburban Boston church I was serving at the time as their senior minister. Not a lot earlier, I'd been made a senior Zen teacher in one of the Japanese koan lineages. The church is a lovely building, a little neo-Gothic cathedral, something unusual for any Unitarian church. It even had 7 steps leading up to an altar. And above the altar, which, for those interested in mashing up traditions, featured a Unitarian flaming chalice crafted by our own Cushing Giese, there was a lovely stained glass window of Jesus with the little children. I can picture it to this day. I was sitting in the 3rd pew from the front on the lectern side. I stared up at the window. I'd long loved it, sort of the best of Christianity, or at least my dream Christianity, when out of the blue, I recalled that line from the renowned Chinese Zen master Xiao Chou, as he was about to embark on a pilgrimage after the death of his teacher. If I see deeper than a 100-year-old sage, I'll teach him. If a 7-year-old has something to teach, I will listen humbly. At that moment, all my sense of knowing, the years of practice, the confirmations, the acknowledgments, all my accumulated wisdom dropped from me like an unnecessary winter coat on a clear spring morning. In that moment, there was only me sitting on that hard pew, the slight chill in the air, and the unique mix of smells in that old sanctuary, a perfume of forgotten days. And, of course, that window. Jesus, my lovely childhood Jesus, and the children, all the little children. Us. All of us. No high, no low, no exceptions. Teachers and students, intimates. Not really one. Not exactly 2. Intimate. My personal faith experience, an aspect of an emerging world perspective, I don't know. But when I find within that not knowing, within this openness, is this. I felt every prayer I'd ever prayed had been answered. Everything as it is, whispering to me, just this, just this. The windows, each of them, just this. The altar, just this. The pulpit, just this. The dust motes flying in the air, just this. That faint mildew smell, just this. And Jesus and the little children. I realized I didn't need anything more. It really has always been present, the universal singing in every particular. Jesus and the children, intimate. And in that moment, everything was complete. In all its brokenness, in all its distinctness, everything was perfect just as it is. Everything fitting another seamlessly like that box in its lid. And with that, I felt a call to be of use, a call to join in the healing of the many wounds, the call of the family, a dream out of the dream. Just this, intimate, intimate.